welcome to Dip Reading, Jewish Tales in Context by Professor Tohar.
Okay, so when we think about Purim, right, like what's the first thing that pops into your head?
Costumes, definitely. And those Gregors or whatever they're called.
Yeah, and the whole Hamantashen thing, right?
Oh yeah, Hamantashen. How could I forget?
It's all about celebration, yeah. But what if I told you that we're diving into a story about Queen Esther, but it's a tragedy?
No, it's not something you hear every day. A Purim tragedy.
This is where it gets interesting. We're looking at this rabbi, Leon of Modena, from back in the 1600s, who wrote this whole play, Leicester. And it's not exactly your typical, lighthearted Purim spiel.
Yeah, talk about a plot twist. So we're lucky enough to be diving into this article by Tohar, and she really breaks down Modena's play. Like, why would he take such a joyous story and turn it into something so, tragic?
Right, so before we get too deep into the play itself, let's talk about this Rabbi Leon of Modena. He sounds like a pretty interesting guy.
To say the least, yeah. Imagine this. It's the Renaissance, you're in Venice, one of the most exciting cities in the world, and you're this rabbi, a scholar, a writer. Oh, and a bit of a gambler on the side.
Wait, hold on. A rabbi who gambles?
You heard right. And if that wasn't enough, he goes and writes this tell-all autobiography, which was pretty scandalous for the time. This wasn't a man afraid of a little controversy.
Wow, okay, so we've got this rabbi who loves to push the envelope, living in this melting pot of cultures like Venice, and he decides to write a play about a biblical queen, but instead of a happy ending, he turns it into a tragedy. And this is where Vashti comes in, right? Because she's not exactly the central figure in the traditional Purim story.
You're getting it. This is where Modena flips the script. You see, everyone always focuses on Esther. She's brave, she saves her people, she's the hero. But Modena focuses on Vashti, the queen who refused to appear before the king when he commanded it.
Which, in most versions of the story, is seen as this act of defiance. She's disobeying her husband, the king.
Exactly. And what does Modena do? He makes her story, the story of Vashti the tragedy.
Interesting. Because her refusal is often seen as, prideful. Like she was too vain to appear before the king and his court.
And that's what makes Modena's take so fascinating. He uses the whole framework of classical tragedy, like the fall of a great person because of their own flaws, and he uses it to completely reimagine Vashti. She's not just being rebellious or vain in his play. She becomes this victim of the expectations placed upon her simply for being a woman.
So instead of Esther being the one who saves the day, Modena wants his audience to see the other side of the story. The woman who dared to stand up to the king, even knowing there could be consequences.
And here's the real kicker. He doesn't just tell her story, he gives her a voice. We're talking these long, powerful monologues where Vashti wrestles with these societal limitations that women face. And get this, the article points out how some of these ideas she's talking about, they mirror Modena's own struggles in his life, almost like he's using the play to give a voice to those who often don't have one.
That's really interesting. So we're talking about this idea of giving a voice to the voiceless. And it makes me think about how Modena was really into this whole idea of truth versus lies, which the article talks about. I mean, what's the connection there?
You're picking up what Modena's putting down, this idea of truth versus lies. That was huge for him. He was constantly thinking about how people present themselves to the world versus who they really are underneath it all.
So it's like in a world that's telling her to be a certain way, Vashti says, nope, I'm not playing that game.
Right. And that totally connects to Modena's own life. Think about it. He's writing this incredibly revealing autobiography, which was pretty daring back then. Clearly, he's grappling with these same ideas about staying true to yourself, even when it's hard.
Yeah. Like, who are you really? Under all the masks we wear for society, it makes you wonder about who else was pushing those boundaries back then. Were there other Vashtis in Modena's world? Like, real women he knew?
Well, get this. The article actually talks about Modena's really good friend, this Jewish poet named Sarah Kopios Sulam. They were tight, like true intellectual soulmates.
No way. Okay, what was she like?
She was brilliant, totally outspoken. Apparently, she even challenged some of the biggest male intellectuals of the day. Not afraid to stir the pot, this one.
Wow. So she was like I'm going to speak my truth even if it ruffles some feathers.
Yeah.
Sounds a little bit like our girl Vashti.
Right, and guess what? Modena dedicated Lester to her.
Okay, that can't be a coincidence. There's got to be a connection there.
Exactly. The article even suggests that Sulam, with her boldness and her willingness to challenge the status quo, might have been a direct inspiration for how Modena portrayed Vashti.
So he's got these strong women in his life, like Sulam, who are living proof that you don't have to just accept the way things are. And he's putting those same ideas about challenging expectations right into his writing.
And don't forget about how Modena defended that woman accused of witchcraft. Think about it. He could have just stayed quiet, but instead, he risks his own reputation to stand up for her.
That's seriously risky, especially back then. To be accused of witchcraft, you were basically ostracized. So he's putting his neck out for this woman, which makes you think, is this him living out the same kind of courage that Vashti showed? The same commitment to truth and integrity?
It really makes you think, right? And it makes his play even more powerful. It's not just him talking about truth versus lies in some abstract way. It's his life, his values. And it's clear he was deeply affected by these incredible independent women he knew, like Sarah Copio Sulam.
See, this is why I love digging into these old stories. You start to see these connections, these hidden patterns. It's like uncovering a whole other layer of history that we don't always hear about.
It's like a puzzle, right? We got these little pieces, Modena's life, his writing, the people he knew, and we start to put them together to see the bigger picture.
So we've got Modena, this complicated guy living in a world obsessed with appearances. He's wrestling with these big questions about truth. And then he writes this play that turns everything on its head and dedicates it to a woman who was anything but ordinary. It's kind of a lot to process.
It's a goldmine, though, right? We're not going to find all the answers, but that's okay. The point is to ask the questions,
Right.
to think critically. Modena wants us to question everything.
So it's like, this isn't just an old play that's totally irrelevant to our lives now.
No way. It's just as relevant today as it was back then. Modena's basically saying, look, don't just accept everything you're told. Pay attention to whose voices are being heard and whose are being silenced.
Wow. Yeah. He's basically dropping the mic on us centuries later.
Exactly. And he's challenging us to find that same courage to stand up for what we believe in, just like the people in his play did.
And it's not always easy to do that, is it? To stand up and say, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about that.
Nope. It takes guts. Just like Vashti standing up to the king, or Modena defending that woman accused of witchcraft. They all could have just played it safe, but they didn't.
Yeah, it's like this thread of courage connecting them all through time. Pretty inspiring when you think about it.
It really is, and that's why Modena's play still matters, even after all these centuries. These weren't just issues back then. This whole struggle to be true to yourself, to be recognized for who you really are, that's something we all deal with.
Totally. So many people feel like they have to hide parts of themselves, right?
Right.
To fit in, to avoid judgment. It makes you wonder, what other stories are out there? What other voices haven't we heard yet?
That's what's so cool about digging into history and art, you know? They have this power to show us a different side of things, to give a platform to people who were silenced or ignored.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Queen Vashti's story, the one that's not quite so celebratory, what's the big takeaway?
Well, on the one hand, it's a fascinating look at this rabbi from the Renaissance, trying to understand these timeless questions, right? But it's also a challenge to us. Modena is basically saying, don't just accept the stories you've always been told. Question them. Look for different points of view.
And to find that courage within ourselves to be authentic, even when it's hard. Just like Vashti.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, if we start looking at things a little differently, we'll discover a whole lot more than we ever expected.
I love that. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Rabbi Leon of Modena's Leicester. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah, and we hope it's given you some things to think about, maybe some new questions to ask.
Keep exploring those hidden stories, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
You have been listening to Dip Reading, Jewish Tales in Context by Professor Tohar. Thank you, and see you next time.